soul awakening, transcendent awakening, unitary awakening, right? There's it's variations on a scheme. But the point is that you can't ever get to that investigation. So this is why the spiritual but not religious thing is so problematic. Because what we do there is we show up and we say, oh, Kundalini's moving through me. Oh, I'm awake. Oh, I'm enlightened. Oh, I had a Satori. Oh, I had a Nirvana. I had a Kensho. I'm in Samadhi. I'm in Nirvikapi Samadhi. And there's no peer review. There's no comparison to anything. And there's a high probability the person has no clue what that even means. They had some state happen, right? And so there's just no depth in most of that spiritual but not religious stuff. And there's no real peer review, and there's no real consensus, and there's no real investigation, and there's no real deep understanding to begin with of what I want to start a new religion that's not linked into any tradition, but that would not even be possible without what all the great traditions have already provided. And so the point is, if you want to know what a transcendent awakening is, or a Satori is, or a Sahaj Samadhi is, or a Nirvikapi Samadhi is, then you have to follow a path, perform injunctions, sometimes for decades, have the experience, submit it to a community of the adequate for peer review, and then you find out. And if you want to know what the DNA of a chimpanzee looks like, you put it under a microscope. Or how it responds to certain stimulus, you put it under a microscope. You perform the injunction by stimulating it in this specific way. You then go to a community of the adequate. If there isn't a database, then people repeat the experiment and see if it comes up again and again and again and again, and then it gets compared, and then it's determined to be a truth. Just like a Kensho or a Satori or a Samadhi or a transcendent awakening or a unitary state awakening is. But they're different modes of testing, but they still follow scientific method. And they're both equally scientific if done effectively. And we want to keep pushing towards that. And so science and spirituality are highly compatible. But Western reduction materialistic science is not the end of science. It's a thin band and type of science that measures things in the upper right, gross matter and energy. Now understanding this then, here's what we do not want to do. We do not want to in some way make the claim that quantum physics proves God. Because God doesn't need quantum physics. And that starts to collapse God, spirit, into a Western scientific materialistic model. And now what we've said is this gigantic, panentheistic, all-inclusive God is really these little bitty parts at the quantum level. That becomes highly confused and highly reductionistic, right? And so, yeah, so does that make the point?
I was looking at it very simplistic because there's the science and the technology of higher brain living, and then it awakes more spirituality within us.
Yeah.
So I thought, here, that's the merge.
And there's not anything wrong with that thought. It's just defining our terms, right? And that's what's so challenging right now, is because there's no traditions that we're using any of these words. You know, when someone in a Zen monastery said they had a Satori, they all had consensus as to what that meant. Now, they would evaluate whether or not that person actually had it. But now in our kind of new age, just postmodern spread of all of this, there's no consensus on even what that means. It's almost impossible to have a conversation, right? It's like, well, I find myself when I'm talking to someone in that spiritual but not religious space, I can't, before we can have a conversation about God, about spirituality, about energy, that one drives me crazy. It's all energy. What does that even mean? You don't even know what that means, right? It's just something you've heard you say. What does it mean? It's all energy, right? It's all consciousness too. And we don't want to, this is a big one, we don't want to reduce consciousness to energy any more than we want to reduce it to particles. They're corollaries, non-reductive corollaries. And so we have to be more precise with our language than just saying this stuff like it's all energy or it doesn't mean anything, right? And it creates great confusion and there's no depth in it and there's no understanding and it doesn't usually lead anyone anywhere. And so before I usually have the conversation, it has to start like this. Okay, can we spend about an hour with you first telling me, what do you mean when you say God? What do you mean when you say consciousness? What do you mean when you say energy? What do you mean when you say enlightenment? What do you mean when you say spirituality? If we can't get there, we can't really even have a conversation about it. And because there is no rigor or tradition that any of that stuff is really linked into in the spiritual but not religious movement, it's just kind of this anything goes spiritual marketplace that is an inch deep and a mile wide. And we just have to be, we want, particularly as we move into the new human university, and this is a good, just a lesson about depth in general, right? If it's the same with when we're out there trying to sell higher brain living and it's positioned as Epoch 6 technology, and we're having confused conversations about alternative therapy and this is energy work and putting it in the middle of, as I said, our website below the lifeline technique and matrix energetics and here's higher brain living and here it's confused. And so this is stuff that we go, and this is stuff that comes out of this, and that we will explore deeply in the new human university. Not only explore, but experience and create great depth around. Because we don't want to be part of the problem. That's what I'm saying. Something is trying to emerge out of this spiritual but not religious, out of this postmodern vacuum, right? Something is trying to emerge out of that. I've used this analogy. The spiritual but not religious is the anarchy of religion. It's like watching the last dozen governments become corrupt and then making the decision that we no longer need government, so we just tear the whole thing down and replace it with anarchy. That's kind of what we've done with religion. We didn't like what we saw around them, so we just gutted them, got rid of the concept, and put the anarchy of religion in its place, which is spiritual but not religious. What's got to come back in, as I've said, is a new religion, in the same way that the solution is a new, higher level government, not the absence of government. Well, that's a little bit of a tirade there that probably had not quite enough to do with your question. Right? You know, never let the question get in the way of the answer you want to give.